For about the past 10 to 12 years, Belgrade has often been referred to in the Belgrade media as a metropolis. The number of inhabitants is pointed to as the main argument, often with exaggeration. 2 million, they say, as if it were some kind of achievement and as if it were necessarily good for a city to have as many residents as possible. Here too, aside from exaggeration, I would say it reflects a certain yearning to finally be part of the quote world, the quote big world. In this case, through the status of a metropolis. Another reason for boasting about Belgrade as a quote metropolis could lie in treating such a status for the capital city as a kind of compensatory triumph after a series of defeats following the breakup of Yugoslavia. Croatia and Slovenia have been in the EU for a decade or two, while Serbia remains one of the poorer countries, one of the poorer European countries, with a rather lacking institutional framework and rule of law, but at least Belgrade is a metropolis, quote. Whereas Zagreb and Ljubljana, a comparison which is incidentally quite irrelevant since Ljubljana is the capital of one of Europe's smallest countries with only 2 million inhabitants, are just mid-sized Central European cities. In Belgrade, you can party every night until dawn and you can go to the store or a bakery even at 2 a.m., which you, on the other hand, cannot do over there. Thus, Belgrade is a quote metropolis. Belgrade has too many houses that are not of an urban type for a metropolis, especially in the municipalities of Zvezdara, Voždovac and Palilula, not to mention the more distant ones. This is primarily because residents of those areas preferred such houses to apartment buildings and because the construction of those neighborhoods was largely unregulated. The houses within those neighborhoods are for the most part highly heterogeneous, and there are no styles characteristic of specific neighborhoods. Everyone was allowed to build whatever kind of house they wanted. It is noticeable that almost all of these houses are separated from one another. That is, they are not row houses. Interestingly, this is often the case even in the city center, on the slope from Vasina to Cara Dušana Street, where the entrance is positioned not frontally but from the side, via a small passageway, which necessitates a gate and a space of about 1.5 meters between two houses. Where does this come from? I assume it stems from the fact that homeowners in Belgrade didn't want to share an exterior wall with a neighbor or have their house directly next to another. Incidentally, what it is, among other things, that is special about Lower Dorćol neighborhood. Namely, it is the persistence of small town style housing, single-story homes, in the central area of a big city. Those neighborhoods have too many narrow streets, though not in the sense of a medieval old town, only 5 to 6 meters wide, sometimes even less, with sidewalks that are too narrow and often blocked. To make these streets reasonably wide, all the buildings on one side would have to be demolished. Even in one of the parts of the city considered attractive for residing in, mostly in the broader city center, such as Vračar, most streets are narrow, 6 to 9 meters, and many street blocks, the rows of buildings between two streets, are excessively long, 150 to 200 meters. What kind of, quote, metropolis is it? Is that where people can barely squeeze past cars on the sidewalk or are often forced to walk on the road? Belgrade is a car-centric city, hostile to pedestrians. Free sidewalks are one of the basic elements of urban civilization. Cars parked on sidewalks are a sign of automotive aggression and basic urban disorder. Forcing people to walk on the road is harassment. It is undignified and dangerous. To those who might cite Knez Mihailova Street as a metropolitan street in Belgrade, that is like a worthy of a metropolis, I would point out that a similar street, in terms of its dimensions and the size and architecture of the buildings along it, exists in Brno in Czechia, which is a city of around 380,000 residents. That is namely Masarykova and its continuation Rašinova Street. Terazije and Kralja Milana streets, that is the Terazije Square and Kralja Milana Street as Grand City areas and streets. Similar locations exist even in Linz, in Austria. Belgrade doesn't have its own Erzsébet Boulevard, Karoli Boulevard, or Pajče Žilinski Street, or Andrassy Avenue, which are streets in Budapest. nor its own Wenceslav Square, or Vinohradska Street, or Masaryk Embankment in Czech, Masarykovo Nabreží in Prague. In short, Belgrade lacks what is essential in European metropolises, a grand avenue, boulevard, or Ringstrasse in German, dominated by traditional European architecture and a series of monumental buildings. The road made up of Cara Dušana, George Washington Street, 27th of March, and Queen Maria Streets could have been Belgrade's Ringstrasse, but its architecture is too varied and inconsistent in scale, with a mix of 1 or 2-story buildings and, on the other hand, buildings with 10 or more floors. And the sidewalks are not wide enough to convey the sense of spaciousness one expects when walking along a grand city boulevard. For pedestrians, Belgrade often gives the impression of being cramped and lacking space. For the same reasons, Boulevard of King Alexander also cannot serve as Belgrade's showcase European metropolitan avenue. The Karađorđeva and Nemanjina streets could also have become Belgrade's Ringstrasse if only Karađorđeva from the corner of Vitpariska to the Belgrade building of the Belgrade Cooperative or Beogradska Zadruga were wider and filled on both sides with appropriately grand buildings instead of being left patchy with a series of low-rise structures and empty lots. Republic Square as a metropolitan element in Belgrade. There are towns with populations between 10 and 30,000 people that have squares up to 3 times larger. The important buildings constructed before 1914 on that square, the National Museum and the National Theatre, are, in terms of their scale, more fitting for a Central European town with 50 to 100,000 inhabitants. The well-known view of the Old Town from the Sava River, which includes part of Karađorđeva Street, the University of Arts Rectorate, the bell tower of the Saborna Church, and the dome of the Patriarchat, resembles the site of a town of 30 to 50,000 people. Belgrade generally lacks public squares. This is evident even in the way Belgraders use the word trg, Serbian word for square, to indicate a location in the city. There's no need for clarification about which square is meant. Everyone knows it refers to Republic Square. Who would assume someone meant Nikola Pasic Square, for example, or any other, let alone any other place labeled a square, which is a square actually only in name? Where is the square in Dorčol, in Slavia? That area with the fountain is a roundabout. In Vračar, in Čukarica, in New Belgrade, Savski Venac municipality has Savski Trg, or Savski Square, most of which is made up of lawns, grass lawns. Studentski Trg, or Student Square, consists of traffic lanes that also serve as a trolleybus turning loop. It has wide sidewalks by Belgrade standards and a patch of greenery. What then makes that space a square? There is even a street named Studentski Trg, named after a non-existent square, because that area is not a square. Besides Republic Square, one of the few spaces that somewhat resembles a proper, that is rectangular square in Belgrade is the area, proper I mean here as in that has certain regularity pertaining to a square. In Belgrade is the area where the Bajloni market is located. Between Skadarska Street, George Washington, George Jovanović, and Drinčićeva streets. If the market were relocated and that space, morphologically a square, were to be turned into an actual square, Belgrade would gain another and simultaneously its largest square in the city center. The number of tourists in Belgrade in 2023 was nearly equal to that in Zagreb that same year, around 1.3 million. The media that refer to Belgrade as a metropolis may think they'll attract more foreign tourists that way, but those who visited even just 2 EU metropolises won't be fooled, and those who stay in Belgrade longer than a few days don't do so because they think it's a metropolis, but precisely because in many ways it is not like European metropolises. They stay in Belgrade for longer when they do so, because of its relative lack of order and because of its randomness. The fact that Belgrade became the capital, first of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later of Yugoslavia, actually harmed the city by spurring overly rapid growth. In terms of city size, it would have made more sense for Zagreb, which in 1910 had 60% more inhabitants than Belgrade, and in 1921 still had 50% more, to be chosen as the capital of the kingdom. At the time, Zagreb also had a larger housing stock and more of the representative buildings suited to hosting national institutions. In 1918, the burden of accommodating a state administration several times larger than that of the Kingdom of Serbia before World War I was placed on poor Belgrade in poor Serbia. In 1910, Belgrade had a population of 85,000. There is no European metropolis today that had fewer than 300,000 inhabitants in 1910. Belgrade did not become the capital of the first Yugoslavia because of its size or because of its economic importance. It became large and economically significant because it was the capital, within the context of Central and Southeastern Europe, of a large state, that is a large state in the context of Central and Southeastern Europe. The main seat, because it became also the main seat of its oversized administration and of its military. After the breakup of Yugoslavia, Belgrade's growth was driven by the arrival of refugees, because Belgrade is also a city of refuge, and by centralization, fueled by fear of further territorial losses. Now, two additions to this text. The forcing of metropole status for Belgrade, which means prioritizing investment in Belgrade, is one of the reasons why most other cities in Serbia are neglected and have been neglected. The idea that population size determines the urban character of a place is even expressed in Serbia's law on local self-government in the Article 23, which states that the prerequisite for city status is that a settlement must have at least 100,000 inhabitants. Only in cases of, it says, only in cases of, I quote, exceptional economic, historical, or geographical reasons, end quote, may places with fewer than 100,000 inhabitants be granted city status. In the Czech Republic, for example, in Czechia now, there are places with even 2 or 3,000, 5 to 6,000, and 10 to 15,000 residents that regularly hold city status. In Germany, a settlement with at least 100,000 people is considered a large city, but city status is held even by towns with 25,000, 20,000, or even 10 and as little as 5,000 inhabitants. Some even smaller settlements also have city status. What distinguishes the city from a village is, above all, higher population density, a more compact settlement structure, a greater concentration of buildings, and the nature of the residents' occupations. That is, that they are not predominantly engaged in farming or animal husbandry, but instead work in services, industry, and commerce. The second edition. Over the past decade, the media have periodically lamented the demolition of some pre-World War II buildings in Belgrade, mostly in the Vračar district. Belgrade has simply grown too large compared to its early 20th century size for all the remaining houses from that era to be preserved. There are still several thousand ground floor and one-story houses in Belgrade from the second half of the 19th and early 20th century. These are structures from a time when Belgrade had between 50 and 100,000 residents. Many of them cannot survive in a city that grew 15-fold between 1910 and 2010. For comparison, Kiev and Bucharest grew 5 to 6 times over that period, Prague 3 to 4 times, and Budapest only about 2 times. When it comes to buildings constructed before World War II, Belgrade has few areas that can be considered architectural wholes, characterized by a certain stylistic unity. And even those it does have are rather small. The frequently cited reason for the noticeable absence of larger areas with any consistent architectural style, with the exception of brutalism and post-war modernism, in Belgrade, is the fact that the city was heavily damaged during World War II. There is no conclusive data on the damage from World War I. At that time, around 50% of residential buildings, at the time of the aftermath of World War II, around 50% of residential buildings in Belgrade were either destroyed, heavily damaged, or slightly damaged. The majority of this percentage falls under the slightly damaged category. For comparison, during World War II, 80% of buildings in Budapest were destroyed or damaged. In Wrocław, in Poland, 70% of buildings were heavily damaged or destroyed. And yet, in the 21st century, those cities resemble their pre-war appearance far more than Belgrade does. You can find areas like Kosančiće Venac even in Central European towns with only 10 to 20,000 inhabitants. The only architectural style represented in Belgrade to a sufficient extent for the city to be considered part of the European architectural heritage map is brutalism. A typical block in central Belgrade municipalities looks something like this. One or two historicist buildings, a modernist building from the 1930s, followed by two 5-story buildings from the 1950s or 1960s, and another from the 21st century. This kind of heterogeneous structure of street blocks does not lend itself to preservation. The prevailing reasoning which imposes itself is thus the following. If stylistic unity was already disrupted long ago by bombing, a new building, or the demolition of an old 1-story house, why not demolish another one and build yet another 6 or 8-story structure? Unfortunately, this kind of architectural cannibalization is the fate of Belgrade.